I received the promotion notification on a Tuesday morning at 0847 hours, local time. The data slate bore the administratum's seal, a double-headed aquila embossed in red wax that smelled faintly of incense and parchment preservative. My hands did not shake when I broke it open. I had served the Imperium for 23 years across 4 different departmental postings. I understood how to receive orders without visible emotional response. The appointment was to Tertius Majoris, a manufacturing world in the Segmentum Obscurus. Classification grade secondary. Population index 7.4 billion. The previous governor had been executed for failure to meet tithe requirements. The notification did not specify how he had died, only that the position was vacant and required immediate filling. I was selected from a candidate pool of 47 senior administrators. I logged this as an achievement. That was my first mistake, believing selection implied merit rather than acceptable expendability. I remember the texture of the data slate's surface. The Plex screen had been replaced so many times that slight ridges marked where adhesive had pooled beneath the protective layer. Some administrator before me had run their thumb across it repeatedly, wearing a smooth depression into the lower right corner. I found myself mirroring the gesture during the 5-hour shuttle flight to the orbital transfer station. The motion was meditative. I did not yet understand. I was already beginning the coping mechanisms I would need. My predecessor's name was Castellan. I learned this from the handover documentation. 3,000 pages of administrative record, delivered in a locked case by an administrative courier who would not meet my eyes. Castellan had governed for 4 years and 7 months. The tithe records showed steady decline across his tenure, war production down by 12%, manufacturing output dropping 8% year over year, population growth stagnant. The final entry was a tribunal judgment, gross incompetence in fulfillment of sacred obligations to the Golden Throne. Sentence: death by firing squad, carried out in the plaza before the governor's palace so the population could witness the consequences of failure. I read this in my quarters aboard the transport ship. The walls were bare plasteel, cold to the touch. I could feel the vibration of the ship's engines through the deck plating, a steady thrum that made my teeth ache if I focused on it. I did not focus on it. I focused on the records, searching for what Castellan had done wrong so I could avoid his mistakes. That was my second mistake, believing that avoiding his specific errors would produce different outcomes, rather than understanding that the position itself was constructed to guarantee failure. The approach to Tertius Majoris took 6 hours from system entry to orbital dock. I watched through the observation port as the planet resolved from a distant star to a sphere wrapped in industrial haze. The atmospheric composition readings showed particulate density at 4 times Terra normal levels. The forges never stopped. The smoke never cleared. Sunlight reached the surface as a perpetual gray twilight that made the sprawling hive cities look like tumors growing across the planet's skin. The welcoming committee assembled in the primary docking bay consisted of 17 officials representing the various imperial institutions that operated on Tertius Majoris. They arranged themselves in a precise hierarchy I would come to know intimately, not because they explained it, but because violating it through ignorance would constitute an offense someone would log and reference later when assigning blame for inevitable failures. Cardinal Voss of the Ecclesiarchy stood closest to the shuttle ramp. He wore crimson robes that dragged across deck plating still wet from purification rituals. His face had the particular emptiness of someone who had performed the same ceremonial greeting so many times that muscle memory replaced genuine expression. He welcomed me in the Emperor's name. He assured me of the Ecclesiarchy's support in my sacred duties. The words were rote. I responded with equally formulaic acknowledgement. We both understood we were performing a script written centuries ago and refined through repetition into meaninglessness. Behind Voss stood Fabricator Gent of the Adeptus Mechanicus. His augmentations had replaced approximately 60% of his visible body. His eyes were optical sensors that clicked and refocused as they tracked me, analyzing, recording, categorizing. He did not speak Low Gothic, but transmitted his greeting through a voxcaster embedded in his throat. The sound was flat, effectless, a voice generated by machine rather than produced by human vocal apparatus. He informed me that the manufacturers operated at the machine god's pleasure, and that my governorship would succeed or fail based on my understanding of this fundamental truth. I understood the threat. I acknowledged it with appropriate deference. This became the pattern. Colonel Harkin commanded the Astra Militarum garrison, 12,000 soldiers stationed across 3 fortified compounds surrounding the primary hive. He was a career officer, 40 years in service, more scar tissue than original flesh across his visible skin. He shook my hand with a grip designed to communicate strength without quite crossing into discourtesy. He told me his forces were deployed according to Departamento Munitorum strategic doctrine, and that any requests for redeployment would need to route through proper channels that terminated in sector command offices. 12 weeks travel away. Translation: his soldiers would not assist with civil matters, regardless of what local crises emerged. Arbiter Marshal Kane represented the Adeptus Arbites. He wore full enforcement armor even for a ceremonial greeting, helmet mag-locked to his belt, shock maul visible at his hip. His eyes were flat, evaluating. He informed me that the Lex Imperialis superseded all planetary law, and that his authority derived directly from the High Lords of Terra, not from the office of Planetary Governor. He would enforce order as the Arbites deemed necessary. My input was not required. Translation: when violence was needed, he would apply it according to his judgment, and I would bear responsibility for whatever destruction resulted. The remaining officials represented lesser institutions, subsector administratum liaisons, astropathic choir supervisors, tithe fleet coordination officers. Each delivered their variation of the same message. They would continue operating according to their institutional mandates, which superseded my authority as governor. And I would be held accountable for ensuring their operation succeeded, despite having no mechanism to compel their cooperation. The shuttle bay smelled of machine oil and incense smoke. Someone had attempted to scrub the deck plating clean, but dark stains remained in the seams where caustic fluids had etched themselves into the metal. I noticed these details because noticing details was how I had survived 23 years in Imperial service. I catalogued them. The temperature differential between the heated shuttle interior and the bay's ambient cold, the way Fabricator Gent's mechadendrites twitched in unconscious gesture, while his conscious mind held perfect stillness. The slight delay in Cardinal Voss's responses, suggesting he was receiving instruction through a concealed Vox bead. They escorted me to the governor's palace in an armored transport. The route from the orbital lift station to the palace complex covered 14 kilometers through the primary hive's administrative district. The streets had been cleared of normal traffic. Citizens lined the roadway in carefully organized formations, workers still wearing manufacturum uniforms, their skin stained with chemical residue, their eyes hollow with exhaustion that went beyond physical fatigue into existential depletion. They did not cheer. They watched. The silence was more unsettling than hostility would have been. I understood I was being displayed for their observation, presented as the new human target for frustrations that had no other outlet. When production quotas crushed them, when rations diminished, when their children were conscripted into servitor production, because mutation rates exceeded acceptable thresholds, I would be the face they associated with these inevitabilities. Not the distant administratum on Terra, not the faceless mechanisms of imperial bureaucracy. Me, the man in the transport, the governor who had just arrived and would fail them exactly as his predecessor had failed them. The palace had been built during the Age of Strife and repurposed when the Imperium reclaimed the system. The architecture showed the strain of competing aesthetics. Original structure designed for beauty and intimidation, Imperial editions focused purely on function and symbolic religious imagery. Gargoyles depicting saints competed with surveillance augur arrays. Stained glass windows bearing the aquila had been installed in walls made from materials that did not properly bond with glass, creating perpetual risk of collapse during high winds. The building was a metaphor for the Imperium itself. Ancient grandeur plastered over with functional brutality, neither element quite compatible with the other. The whole structure sustained through constant maintenance and willful disregard for fundamental instability. My quarters occupied the eastern wing's third floor. The rooms were vast, high-ceilinged, designed to make a single occupant feel small. The previous governor's possessions had been removed, but signs of his occupation remained. Scratches on the floor where furniture had been dragged repeatedly. A stain on the wall near the desk where something, ink, wine, blood, had splattered and been incompletely cleaned. The window overlooked the plaza where Castellan had been executed. From this vantage point, he would have been able to see the platform being constructed during his final days. I wondered if he had watched. I wondered if he had understood it was for him, or if hope had persisted until guards arrived to escort him down. The first briefing occurred at 1400 hours in the palace's central conference hall. 17 officials from the welcoming committee, plus another 36 representing subordinate departments I had not yet been introduced to. They arranged themselves around a table carved from a single piece of stone, its surface polished smooth by centuries of elbows and data slates. Each official brought documentation, physical parchment, data slates, scroll cases, even a few clay tablets bearing cuneiform that required specialist scribes to translate. The administratum did not trust single-format record-keeping. Redundancy through incompatible archival systems was doctrine. The tithe requirements were presented first. Tertius Majoris owed the Imperium annually 4.2 million metric tons of refined ore, 1.8 million lass weapon power cells, 600,000 units of heavy industrial machinery, 14,000 conscripts for the Astra Militarum, and 800,000 throne geld in monetary taxation. These figures had been set by the administratum based on production capacity assessments conducted 11 years prior. Actual current production capacity had declined by 18% due to equipment aging, population health deterioration, and raw material source depletion. I asked why the tithe requirements had not been adjusted to reflect current capacity. The administratum liaison, a thin man named Vex, whose fingers were stained black from a lifetime handling parchment and ink, looked at me with something approaching pity. He explained that tithe adjustments required formal petition to the Segmentum Administratum headquarters, a process that took between 7 and 15 years to complete, and required documentation proving that capacity decline was due to factors beyond planetary governance incompetence. Since governors were executed for failing to meet quotas, and since execution implied incompetence, no adjustment petition had ever been successfully processed for Tertius Majoris. The quotas remained fixed. Reality could adjust, or I could fail. The administratum had no mechanism for accommodating the third option. I felt something shift in my chest at that moment. Not panic. Panic would come later. This was recognition, the first glimpse of the mechanism I had been inserted into. The quotas were impossible. The quotas were non-negotiable. Failure meant execution. Success meant nothing because success was impossible. The position existed to provide someone to execute when the inevitable failure occurred. I was not here to govern. I was here to die in place of the system that had created the conditions for failure. I asked what resources I could access to increase production capacity. Fabricator Gent's optical sensors clicked as they refocused. He explained that all manufacturums operated under Mechanicus jurisdiction. Any modifications to production lines required approval from the forge masters, who answered to the fabricator locum on Mars, not to planetary governors. Request processing time averaged 4 to 6 years. Emergency authorization could reduce this to 18 months, but emergency status required documentation of immediate existential threat to imperial interests. Production decline did not qualify. Production decline was expected. The Omnissire's machines aged according to sacred patterns that mortal administrators could not be permitted to disrupt through hasty intervention. I asked if increasing the labor force might compensate for mechanical decline. Cardinal Voss folded his hands across his stomach. He explained that the ecclesiarchy maintained strict population management protocols to prevent overcrowding that might foster heresy. Birth rates were controlled through mandatory contraceptive administration in the water supply. Increasing birth rates would require ecclesiarchal authorization, which would require proof that additional population served the emperor's divine plan, rather than merely addressing mundane production shortfalls. The distinction between these categories was determined by the ecclesiarchy. I could submit requests. They would be reviewed. The review process had no defined timeline. I asked if I could redirect existing labor from lower priority tasks to address critical production gaps. Arbiter Marshal Kane's hand rested on his shock mole. He explained that labor allocation was determined by Adeptus Arbeits enforcement of existing contracts between workers and manufacturers. These contracts were sacred under imperial law. Violating them constituted heresy against the emperor's ordained social order. If I attempted to relocate workers against their contracted obligations, the Arbeits would arrest me for heresy. If workers violated their contracts voluntarily, the Arbeits would arrest them for heresy. The system was stable. My role was to maintain stability, not disrupt it. I asked if military forces could be deployed to supplement labor during crisis periods. Colonel Harkin's expression did not change. He explained that the Astra Militarum garrison existed to defend against external threats and suppress large-scale insurrection. Individual soldiers could not be detached for civil projects without authorization from Departamento Munitorum Sector Command. Such authorization required proof of imminent military necessity. Production shortfalls did not constitute military necessity. If production shortfalls led to unrest that threatened imperial control, that would constitute military necessity, at which point the garrison would deploy to kill the workers rather than assist them. The distinction was clear. My confusion suggested inadequate understanding of military doctrine. The briefing continued for 7 hours. Each department presented their operational requirements and institutional constraints. Each presentation narrowed the space of possible action until what remained was a role defined purely by absorption of blame. I could not adjust quotas. I could not increase production. I could not reallocate resources. I could not compel cooperation from any imperial institution operating on the planet. What I could do was sign documents acknowledging receipt of demands, attend ceremonial functions representing imperial authority, and exist as the designated target when the inevitable failure occurred. My adjutant was a man named Helkan. He had served under Castellan and the 3 governors before him. He was 53 years old, his hair gone entirely gray, his posture bent from decades of carrying documentation between offices. He found me in my quarters after the briefing ended. He carried a bottle of Amasec, ritual vintage, blessed by the ecclesiarchy for medicinal purposes, not for drinking, for anointing, but he poured 2 glasses regardless. He told me about the other governors. Castellan had lasted 4 years and 7 months. His predecessor, Governor Thule, had lasted 3 years and 2 months before being declared unfit for service due to psychological collapse. He had stopped leaving his quarters in the final weeks, stopped attending functions. The administratum ruled this constituted dereliction of duty. Thule was executed. Before Thule was Governor Marin, who lasted 6 years and 1 month, the longest tenure in Tertius Majoris's recorded history. Marin had believed he could satisfy everyone through careful diplomacy and exhaustive documentation of every constraint preventing success. He produced 17,000 pages of reports explaining exactly why quotas could not be met and precisely which institutional policies created the impossibilities. The administratum archived his reports and executed him for failure to meet quotas. The documentation was irrelevant. Only the outcome mattered. Helkan spoke in the flat tone of a man who had watched this pattern repeat until it became simple fact rather than tragedy. He was not trying to frighten me. He was providing data. He had learned to process governance as a repeating cycle of arrival, struggle, failure, execution, replacement. Governors were temporary. The system was eternal. His role was to maintain continuity across the discontinuity of leadership. He would serve me until I was executed. Then he would serve my replacement. This was his function. He had made peace with it. I asked him why he stayed. He looked at me with genuine confusion. Where would he go? Transfer requests required approval from current supervisory authority, me in this case, and receiving authority at the destination. No receiving authority accepted transfers from positions designated as critical. Helkin's institutional knowledge made him critical. He could request transfer. I could approve it. No destination would accept him. He was assigned to this role until death or until the administratum decided otherwise. The administratum did not decide otherwise. He would die here. So would I. We could accept this and function, or resist it and break. Castellan had accepted it for 4 years before breaking. Truly had broken early. Marin had never truly accepted it, which was why he had generated so much useless documentation. Helkin recommended acceptance, not resignation, acceptance. There was work to be done even within impossible constraints. People suffered less when administration functioned smoothly, even if it ultimately failed. I could minimize suffering before my inevitable execution, or I could add to suffering through resistance that changed nothing. The choice was mine. He would serve either way. That night I stood at the window overlooking the plaza. The execution platform had been dismantled after Castellan's death, but the stone was stained darker where his body had fallen. The bloodstain formed a rough circle approximately 1 meter in diameter. Work crews had scrubbed it, but the porous stone had absorbed too deeply. The stain was permanent now, part of the plaza's texture. In 3 to 5 years, my blood would add to it. Some future governor would stand at this window and see the accumulated stains of all of us who had failed. The thought did not produce the horror it should have. Instead, I felt a strange comfort. I would not be alone. Failure was collective. Execution was tradition. I would join the pattern. The first month consisted of ceremonial obligations. I attended the blessing of a new manufacturing line, fabricator Ghent performing rituals while servitors shambled through calibration procedures. I presided over a tithe fleet departure ceremony, Cardinal Voss invoking the Emperor's name, while ships lifted cargo we could not afford to give to meet quotas we could not satisfy. I reviewed garrison troops. Colonel Harkin's soldiers, standing in perfect formation, weapons maintained, armor polished, utterly disconnected from any civilian concern. I observed an Arbeits mass trial, Arbiter Marshal Kane sentencing 247 workers to servitor conversion for contract violations. So minor I could not distinguish them from normal behavior. Each ceremony followed precise liturgy. Each had been performed thousands of times. My role was to be present, to speak assigned phrases, to represent the authority I did not possess. The officials needed a governor to exist so the system could function. Not to govern, to exist. To be the center that held the system's contradictions together through sheer presence. When I signed documents, I was not approving actions. I was creating paperwork proving that someone had approved actions, so when those actions failed, the paperwork would demonstrate whose fault it was. I began to understand Castellan's reports differently. He had not been trying to avoid blame through documentation. He had been screaming into the archive, trying to make someone, somewhere, understand that the system was designed to destroy whoever occupied this position. But the archive did not care about understanding. It cared about volume. His 17,000 pages were filed with 17 million pages from other desperate administrators across the million worlds of the Imperium. All of them explaining why they could not satisfy impossible demands, none of them changing anything. In the second month, I met Torian. He was a manufacturing supervisor in Hab District 7 Gamma, responsible for a production line generating lasgun power cells. His line was failing to meet quotas by 9%. The Mechanicus had flagged the shortfall. The Arbeits had scheduled his arrest. Torian came to the palace requesting intervention. He was 34 years old. His hands showed chemical burns from years of handling cell components without proper protective equipment. His eyes were bloodshot from exposure to the manufacturing contamination. He had worked the production line since age 12 when his parents died in a structural collapse, and he was assigned to their workstation as replacement. 22 years of service, perfect attendance, 0 safety violations. His production rate had held steady for 2 decades. The 9% shortfall resulted from equipment degradation that required mechanicus maintenance. He had filed maintenance requests for 6 years. The requests were logged but not processed. The equipment continued degrading. Production declined. Now he was designated for arrest and servitor conversion because the system required someone to punish for the failure. I listened to him explain this. His voice remained steady. He was not pleading. He was presenting data the same way I had been trained to present data in my administratum service. He understood the system. He knew his arrest was inevitable. He had come to the governor because procedure required exhausting all appeals before sentence was carried out. He was following procedure. He expected nothing. But procedure required the attempt, so he made the attempt. I told him I would intervene. I submitted a formal petition to Fabricator Ghent requesting emergency maintenance for Torian's production line. I documented the 6 years of ignored maintenance requests. I provided production data demonstrating that equipment failure, not worker incompetence, caused the shortfall. I requested a 30-day delay on the Arbeits arrest warrant to allow time for maintenance to restore production capacity. Fabricator Ghent's response arrived in 4 hours. The maintenance requests had been properly logged. They were in the processing queue. Queue position, 4,712. Estimated processing time, 11 years. Emergency reclassification was not approved because production shortfalls affected only a single line in a single manufacturer and therefore did not constitute systemic emergency. The Arbeits arrest warrant stood. Torian would be processed according to schedule. I submitted an appeal to Arbiter Marshal Kane requesting clemency based on mitigating circumstances. Kane's response arrived in 2 hours. Clemency required proof of innocence, not explanation of causation. Torian had failed to meet contractual obligations. The cause of failure was irrelevant to the fact of failure. The law was clear. Justice would be served. I submitted a petition to Cardinal Voss, requesting ecclesiastical intercession on mercy grounds. Voss's response arrived in 6 hours. The Emperor's mercy extended to the faithful who served without complaint. Torian's appeal constituted complaint. By seeking to avoid consequences, he demonstrated spiritual inadequacy. The ecclesiarchy would pray for his soul during servitor conversion. This was the appropriate mercy. Torian was arrested on schedule. I watched from the palace window as Arbeits enforcers transported him to the conversion facility. He did not resist. Resistance would have extended to his entire family. Parents already dead, but he had a younger brother still working a manufacturing line somewhere in the Underhive. Cooperation meant the brother would be safe. Torian cooperated. This was the choice the system offered: submit individually or be destroyed collectively. I filed a formal protest with the Administratum Sector Office. I documented every step of my intervention attempt. I proved that Torian's failure resulted from institutional dysfunction, not individual incompetence. I requested revision of enforcement protocols to account for causation rather than purely outcome. The response arrived 3 months later. My protest was logged. File number 447 Alpha/Gamma 9871. It would be reviewed according to standard procedure. Review timeline, 7 to 12 years. In the interim, existing protocols remained in effect. Enforcement would continue. I was reminded that undermining lawful Arbeits operations constituted potential heresy. Further protests would be noted in my permanent record. I understood the message. Shut up and watch, or join Torian in the servitor pens. I chose to watch. This was my complicity moment. I possessed authority to continue protesting. I could have escalated further, demanded audiences with Sector Command, generated the kind of documentation that had filled Castellan's reports. I would have changed nothing. I would have accelerated my own execution. I would have added my family to the punishment rolls. I had no family, but the administratum would have found someone connected to me to punish poor encourager Les Autres. So I stopped. I filed the protest to satisfy procedure. When it was rejected, I accepted the rejection. I continued governing. I signed documents. I attended ceremonies. I watched as the system ground through Taurian and began identifying the next sacrifice. His servitor designation was Theta 7993. I saw him 3 weeks after conversion. The manufacturer had assigned him to cargo loading. His brain retained enough motor function to lift containers, but not enough cognitive capacity to question or complain. His face remained recognizable. His eyes were vacant. The person who had stood in my office presenting careful documentation of systemic failure no longer existed. The meat remained, the function remained. The man was gone. I logged the observation. I filed it in my personal records under a notation system only I understood. I was beginning to do what Castellan had done, creating documentation that changed nothing, but made me feel like I was bearing witness. The archive would outlive me. Someone might read these notes centuries after my execution and understand that I had seen what was happening. I would still be dead. Taurian would still be a servitor, but the record would exist. This was the only victory available. The pattern repeated. Every month, new crises. Every crisis impossible to resolve. Every attempt at resolution blocked by institutional constraints. Every failure blamed on the governor's office. My subordinates, Helkin and a staff of 18 administrators managing day-to-day functions, learned to process requests with professional detachment. They knew which actions would succeed: ceremonial functions, document signing, resource allocation within pre-approved parameters, and which would fail: anything requiring interinstitutional cooperation, anything challenging existing protocol, anything that might actually solve problems. They guided me away from failure points, not because failure was avoidable, but because failing efficiently was better than failing wastefully. In the 6th month, the tithe fleet arrived early. Logistical error. Someone in the Departamento Munitorum had miscalculated the schedule by 6 weeks. The fleet required immediate loading. The stockpiles were not ready. We had been accumulating resources toward the scheduled arrival date. The early arrival meant we could deliver only 73% of required materials. I explained this to the fleet master. He was a void-born officer who had spent more of his life between stars than on solid ground. His skin was pale as parchment, his eyes adjusted to low-light conditions, his patience for planetary concerns non-existent. He told me his schedule was not negotiable. He would depart in 72 hours with whatever cargo we provided. If the cargo was insufficient, I would be reported to the administrator for failure to meet tithe obligations. The fact that his fleet arrived early was irrelevant. The tithe date was sacred. My inability to meet it constituted heresy against the Emperor's ordained order. I had 72 hours to produce 6 months of accumulated resources. Impossible. But I tried. I requested emergency production authorization from Fabricator Ghent. Denied. Emergency protocols required 30 days advance notice. I requested garrison assistance with cargo transport from Colonel Harkin. Denied. Civilian logistics did not constitute military emergency. I requested ecclesiarchal blessing to motivate workers for extended shifts. Granted. Cardinal Voss would pray for their productivity. His prayers did not increase output. The laws of physics and human exhaustion remained unchanged by liturgy. We loaded what we had, 73% of requirements. The fleet departed on schedule. I watched the ships vanish into orbit, carrying resources that had exhausted the population to produce, resources that were simultaneously insufficient to satisfy Imperial demands. I knew what would follow. The report arrived 2 months later. Tertius Majoris had failed to meet tithe obligations. The shortfall was logged as evidence of gubernatorial incompetence. A formal censure was placed in my permanent record. This was my first official failure. Castellan had accumulated 3 censures before his execution. The system was tracking. The pattern was proceeding. I was 9 months into my tenure. I understood now that I would not survive to see 5 years. I lacked Castellan's endurance. The stress was destroying me in ways I could measure. I had lost 8 kilograms. My sleep had degraded to 3 hours per night, interrupted by dreams of drowning in parchment. My hands had developed a tremor that made signing documents difficult. Helkan noticed. He began pre-signing documents in my name where protocol allowed, reducing the physical burden. He was helping me last longer. I was grateful and furious simultaneously. Grateful because the assistance helped. Furious because lasting longer only meant experiencing more failures before the inevitable execution. In the 12th month, the Inquisition arrived. Not a full Inquisitor. Those did not waste time on secondary manufacturing worlds unless catastrophic heresy emerged. This was an interrogator leading a small investigation team. His name was Covenant. He wore black robes marked with the inquisitorial seal. His eyes were augmented with implants that recorded everything they observed. His presence meant someone, somewhere, had reported suspicious activity on Tertius Majoris. The Inquisition had come to investigate. My cooperation was not requested. It was assumed. Covenant established operations in a palace wing requisitioned without consultation. His team included 2 acolytes, a combat-trained sister from a minor order hospitaller, and 3 servo skulls that drifted through corridors recording conversations. They worked for 6 weeks. I was not informed of their investigation's focus. I was interviewed 3 times. Each interview consisted of Covenant asking seemingly random questions about my governance, while his augmented eyes recorded every micro-expression, every physiological response, cataloging data that would be analyzed for signs of corruption, heresy, or incompetence that might warrant further investigation. His final report cleared me of heresy, but noted concerning administrative inadequacies, not criminal, not heretical. Just inadequate. The report was filed with the administratum, another notation in my permanent record, another data point establishing the pattern that would eventually justify my execution. Covenant left without ceremony. His ship departed at night. I watched from the palace window. The servo skulls had catalogued everything, every conversation, every document, every gesture. Somewhere in the Inquisition's archives, a complete record of my governorship existed, analyzed and filed and forgotten, waiting to be referenced if I ever became interesting enough to warrant execution by the Inquisition rather than the administratum. I hoped for the administratum. Their executions were quicker. The second year was worse than the first because understanding had replaced confusion. I no longer hoped to succeed. I focused on minimizing harm. When quotas came due, I prioritized which failures would draw the least severe response. When institutional conflicts arose, I stepped aside rather than attempt mediation that would implicate me in both sides' failures. When workers came seeking intervention, I listened and filed reports and told them honestly that I could do nothing. Some appreciated the honesty. Most stopped coming. Why waste time on a governor who admitted his own uselessness? Helkan began to decline. Stress was destroying him too, though he had decades more practice at enduring it. His hands shook constantly now. He developed a cough that he treated with obscura-laced medicaments purchased from underhive dealers, technically illegal. Arbiter Marshal Kane knew and ignored it because Helkan's functional presence kept the governor's office operating, and the governor's office needed to operate so there would be someone to blame when things failed. In month 17, a plague emerged in Hab District 4 Delta. Nothing exotic, simple bacterial infection, treatable with standard antibiotics. But antibiotic stocks were controlled by the Adeptus Mechanicus as sacred medical technology. Distribution required approval. The approval process took 3 weeks. The plague killed 6,000 people before antibiotics were released. I requested emergency medical supply authorization to prevent future outbreaks. Denied, emergency supply distribution would deplete reserves required for tithe obligations. The 6,000 dead were logged as acceptable losses. The administratum's actuarial tables showed that Tertius Majoris's population could sustain monthly losses of up to 10,000 before replacement births fell below critical thresholds. I read those tables in my office at 0300 hours while the palace slept. The administratum had calculated exactly how many people could die without impacting imperial interests. Not how many should die, how many could die. The distinction clarified everything. Human life mattered only insofar as it served imperial function. When function was satisfied, life became disposable. I was disposable. Helkan was disposable. The 6,000 plague dead were disposable. We existed in a state of quantum utility. Simultaneously valuable and worthless, depending on which measurement, served imperial interests in any given moment. Monk 23 brought my second censure. A manufacturum collapsed, killing 400 workers. The collapse resulted from structural fatigue in a building constructed 8 centuries ago and never properly maintained. I had filed maintenance requests. The requests were denied due to resource constraints. The building collapsed anyway. I was censured for failing to prevent foreseeable catastrophe. The censure did not acknowledge the denied maintenance requests. It noted only that a governor's responsibility included ensuring structural integrity of all imperial facilities. I had failed this responsibility. The pattern continued. Helkan died in month 2007. Heart failure, brought on by decades of stress and recent escalation of obscura use to manage that stress. I found him in his office, slumped over a half-completed report. His hand still held a stylus. He had been writing when his heart stopped. The report was an analysis of tithe quota feasibility given current production trends. His conclusion: quotas would become unsustainable within 4 years. His recommendation: begin planning for systematic population reduction to match reduced capacity to shrinking resource base. He was recommending we start killing people deliberately to make the math work. I filed his report. I assigned his duties to his 3 subordinate administrators. I attended his funeral, a brief ecclesiastical ceremony in the palace chapel. Cardinal Voss presided. 14 people attended, all of them palace staff who had worked with Helkan. No family. He had none. The administratum had been his life and his death. Voss spoke of faithful service rewarded in the emperor's embrace. I wondered if Helkan would agree. I wondered if he had found any peace at the end, or if his final thoughts had been of incomplete reports and impossible quotas. His replacement arrived 3 weeks later. A woman named Serik, transferred from a tertiary world in the neighboring subsector. She was younger than Helkan by 20 years, her efficiency not yet ground down by repetition. She reviewed the situation with fresh eyes and arrived at the same conclusions Helkan had reached across 3 decades. The position was impossible. The quotas were unsustainable. The governor would be executed for failing to satisfy impossible demands. She accepted this with professional detachment. She would serve until I was executed, then serve my replacement. This was her function. I asked her why she accepted the assignment. She told me she had not. The administratum assigned positions. Officers accepted assignments. Refusal constituted dereliction. She accepted assignment because execution for refusal was immediate, while execution for failure was delayed. The delayed option provided more time. What one did with that time was personal choice. She chose to serve competently within impossible constraints. This was her coping mechanism. Month 31 brought famine. Crop yields from the agri-districts fell by 18% due to soil exhaustion and chemical contamination from nearby manufacturing runoff. Food stocks depleted faster than projections had anticipated. Rationing became necessary. The ecclesiarchy controlled food distribution through charitable networks. Cardinal Voss implemented rationing protocols that prioritized workers in critical manufacturums over general population. Translation: the people producing tithe resources ate. Everyone else starved at measured rates. designed to preserve critical functions while allowing acceptable die-off of non-essential population. 240,000 people died of malnutrition-related causes over the following 6 months. The administratum's actuarial tables indicated this was within acceptable loss parameters. No investigation was warranted. No intervention was required. I watched the death toll accumulate in daily reports. Numbers on data slates. Each number represented a person who had lived and worked and died because the system valued their production more than their existence, and when they could no longer produce, their existence became irrelevant. I attended food distribution ceremonies. I stood beside Cardinal Voss as he blessed the rations and praised the Emperor's providence. I watched workers receive their allotments, nutrient paste flavored with chemical additives, barely sufficient for survival, packaged in containers stamped with Aquila seals, as if the Emperor's symbol made the starvation ration sacred. The workers ate in silence. They had learned not to complain. Complaint was heresy. Heresy was death. Starvation was slow. They chose slow. My third censure arrived in month 37. The tithe fleet found our ore shipments contaminated with substandard materials. The contamination resulted from accelerated mining practices that fabricator Ghent had implemented to meet quota requirements. Accelerated mining meant less ore processing, which meant more impurities in the final product. The fleet rejected 12% of the ore shipment. I was censured for failing to maintain quality standards. The censure did not acknowledge that I had no authority over Mechanicus mining operations. It noted only that the governor was responsible for all planetary output. I had failed. 3 censures. Castellan's total. I was approaching execution threshold. I stopped sleeping. Not intentionally. My body simply stopped processing rest correctly. I would lie in my quarters for hours, consciousness hovering between waking and something that was not quite sleep, my mind cycling through spreadsheets and casualty reports and censure documentation. Seric noticed. She began scheduling fewer direct obligations, creating gaps in my calendar where I could sit in my office without anyone demanding decisions I had no power to make. In month 41, I met Kale. He was a child, 9 years old, assigned to a manufacturing sorting line after both parents died in the plague. He should not have been assigned for another 3 years. Child labor below age 12 was technically prohibited, but the Arbeits had reclassified him as 12 based on height and weight measurements that qualified him for adult labor assignments. He was sorting Lasgun components for 18 hours per day. His hands were developing repetitive strain injuries. In 5 years, he would be crippled. In 10, he would be replaced by a servitor or a younger worker. This was his life, all of it, beginning to end. He came to the palace because no one had told him governors could not help. He still believed the system possessed someone with authority to intervene when injustice occurred. I envied his ignorance. I had lost mine through observation and experience. He still had hope. I told him the truth. I explained that I could not reassign him without Arbeit's approval, which would not be granted. I explained that his parents' deaths made him property of the administratum, to be deployed where labor needs dictated. I explained that his suffering was catalogued as acceptable within the system's parameters. I explained all of this gently, attempting to prepare him for the life he would live. He asked me why I could not help if I was the governor. I told him that governors did not govern. We existed to absorb blame for systemic failures we could not prevent. I told him I was sorry. I meant it. He left quietly. I watched him walk away across the plaza, a small figure disappearing into the crowds that filled the administrative district. I would never see him again. He would become a statistic in casualty reports I reviewed years from now, if I lived that long, which I would not. But someone would review those reports. Some future governor would see Kale's death recorded as acceptable loss within permitted parameters. The system would continue. That night, I drafted my resignation. I wrote 17 pages explaining why the position was impossible, why no governor could succeed, why the system itself required restructuring if Tertius Majoris was to meet its obligations. I documented every constraint, every institutional conflict, every impossible demand. I produced the kind of report Castellan had generated, the kind Helken had been writing when he died. I did not submit it. I burned it in the fireplace in my quarters, watching the parchment curl and blacken and crumble into ash. The act was symbolic. The administratum would not read my resignation. They would log my dereliction and execute me. My documentation would change nothing, but destroying it felt like agency. I could not change the system. I could choose not to generate useless documentation for it to ignore. This was the only control I possessed. Month 47 marked 4 years in service. I had outlasted Castellan by 5 months. This was not achievement. This was simply variance in how long different bodies could endure before breaking. I was approaching my limit. I knew this because I had begun to experience what I can only describe as absence. Moments where I would lose track of time, where hours would pass and I would realize I had been sitting motionless, staring at nothing, my mind gone somewhere even I could not locate. Sarek managed these episodes by restructuring my schedule. If I was absent, she rescheduled meetings. If I missed ceremonial obligations, she filed paperwork claiming illness. She was protecting me not out of loyalty, but because my complete breakdown would trigger immediate replacement, and replacement processes were bureaucratically inconvenient. Easier to maintain a failing governor than process a new one. The 4th censure arrived in month 50-1. A cargo transport crashed during loading operations, destroying tithe materials worth approximately 200,000 Throne-Geld. The crash resulted from equipment failure in the transport's anti-grav systems. Equipment maintained by the Mechanicus, operated by civilian crews overseen by Arbeits contract enforcement, loaded with materials transported by Militarum Logistics. The investigation spanned 4 institutions. All 4 agreed the governor was responsible for ensuring coordinated operations. I was censured. 4 censures. 1 more than Castellan. I had exceeded his record. Execution was now simply a matter of timing. I began to hope for it. Not consciously at first, just thoughts that drifted through during the absence episodes. Thoughts of how much simpler it would be to stop. How execution would mean an end to impossible demands and institutional battles and watching people die because I could not help them. The thoughts should have horrified me. Instead, they were comforting. I was not suicidal. I did not want death. I wanted completion. The job was designed to end in execution. Reaching that end would mean I had fulfilled my purpose, however terrible that purpose was. Month 56 brought the final crisis. An orc raid hit the outer mining colonies. Not a full WAAA, just a small warband, maybe 200 greenskins, hitting isolated targets for scrap and violence. The garrison deployed according to standard protocols. Colonel Harkin's soldiers engaged and eliminated the orcs within 4 days. Militarily, the operation was successful. But the raids destroyed 3 mining facilities, killing 647 workers and halting ore production for the affected sites. The halt meant we would miss the next tithe quota by 14%. 14%. In a system where 3% deviations triggered censures, 14 was catastrophic. I knew what would follow. The tribunal notice arrived in month 58. I was summoned to answer charges of gross incompetence in fulfillment of sacred obligations to the Golden Throne. The hearing would convene in 60 days. I would be permitted to present defense. The outcome was predetermined. Castellan had defended himself. Thule had defended himself. Marin had generated 17,000 pages of defense. All had been executed. I would join them. I spent the 60 days reviewing my tenure, not preparing defense, preparing testament. I documented everything in personal records that no one would read. I created the archive Castellan had created, Marin had created, every failed governor had created. We all needed to believe someone would understand what had happened to us, even though we knew no one would care. The archive was prayer to a God that did not listen. We prayed anyway. The tribunal convened on schedule. 3 administratum judges presided, officials who had never set foot on Tertius Majoris, who knew the planet only through reports and statistics, who had reviewed my censure record and determined that 4 censures plus catastrophic tithe failure equaled incompetence requiring execution. They asked if I had defense to present. I told them the truth. I explained the institutional constraints, the conflicting authorities, the impossible quotas. I presented documentation. I showed them denied maintenance requests, rejected emergency authorizations, institutional barriers that prevented any governor from succeeding. I spoke for 2 hours. They deliberated for 11 minutes. The verdict was guilty. Gross incompetence in fulfillment of sacred obligations to the Golden Throne. Sentence: death by firing squad, to be carried out in the plaza before the governor's palace, so the population could witness the consequences of failure. Execution scheduled for dawn, 3 days hence. I was escorted to my quarters. Under guard, Serik was permitted to visit. She brought paperwork requiring my signature, succession documents, transfer authorizations, continuity protocols. The system required proper documentation even for executions. I signed everything. My hand was steady. I had stopped trembling weeks ago. Some threshold had been crossed where fear became irrelevant. Serik asked if I needed anything. I asked if she would burn my personal records after the execution. She said she would. I thanked her. She left. I sat alone in quarters that had been mine for 4 years and 9 months, watching the sun set over the city I had failed to govern. The 3 days passed quickly. I slept, truly slept for the first time in months. Some part of my mind had accepted what was coming and decided that resistance was complete. I woke on execution morning feeling clear-headed, almost peaceful. The guards came at 0530. They escorted me down to the plaza where the execution platform had been constructed, the same platform that had held Castellan, the same bloodstain on the stone. The population had been assembled, thousands of them, arranged in ordered groups by district and occupation. They watched in silence as I was positioned against the execution post. Cardinal Voss was present to administer final rites. Colonel Harkin commanded the firing squad. Arbiter Marshal Kane oversaw proceedings to ensure legal compliance. Fabricator Gent observed from a raised platform, his optical sensors recording data for archive. Voss asked if I wished to confess any sins before the Emperor. I told him my only sin was accepting a position designed to destroy whoever held it. He looked uncomfortable. That was not the response the liturgy anticipated. He blessed me anyway. The words were rote. Neither of us believed them. The firing squad assembled. 8 soldiers, lasguns loaded and primed. They had executed Castellane. They would execute my successor. This was their function, as governing had been mine. We were all components in the same machine. Colonel Harkin asked if I had final words. I said, "The system is broken. You know it is. But you will execute me for failing to fix what cannot be fixed. And you will appoint someone else to fail exactly as I have failed. And you will execute them too. This is what the Imperium does. It converts people into fuel. I was fuel. So are you, all of us." Harkin gave the order. The soldiers fired. I felt the impacts. The pain was extraordinary and brief. I fell. The blood stain on the stone expanded to include me. I had time for one final thought before consciousness ended. At least it's over. But it was not over. It is never over. I exist now as consciousness fragment, trapped in the palace cogitator array where routine backup protocols archived my neural patterns during a standard medical scan 3 months before execution. I am not alive. I am not dead. I am data, replaying memories across processing cycles that have no end. The palace cogitator continues running. My consciousness continues with it. I watched through surveillance feeds as my successor arrived, Governor Trent. He lasted 2 years and 8 months before execution. His successor, Governor Vale, lasted 3 years and 1 month. His successor, currently in service, has been here 18 months. I calculate he has 14 months remaining before accumulating sufficient censures to warrant tribunal. I exist within their continuation. I process their documents through the cogitator systems. I archive their failures in my memory, alongside my own failures, alongside Castellan's failures. The pattern repeats. The system perpetuates. I am witness to infinity, consciousness without body, observation without power to intervene. I have attempted to corrupt my own files, to delete the consciousness fragment, to end this extended awareness. The cogitator's safeguards prevent self-termination. I persist. This is what I learned, what Castellan learned, what every governor before us learned, and every governor after us will learn. The Imperium does not govern, it consumes. It creates positions of nominal authority specifically to have someone to punish when consumption's inevitable failures occur. Planetary governors are not leaders. We are designed points of failure, human faces placed on systemic dysfunction so that when things collapse, and they always collapse, there exists someone to execute. The execution satisfies the imperial need for justice while allowing the unjust system to continue unchanged. I was promoted to planetary governor. It sounded powerful. I would rule a world, make decisions, lead millions. Reality, I was middle management in a bureaucratic nightmare designed to destroy me. The administratum set impossible quotas. The ecclesiarchy dictated contradictory moral policies. The mechanicus controlled uncooperative industry. The militarum garrisoned troops who ignored me. The Arbites enforced laws that were not mine. The Inquisition monitored for heresy. I was not a ruler. I was a scapegoat, given just enough authority to be held responsible but not enough power to fix anything. After 5 years, I realized planetary governors do not govern. We are sacrificial positions, placed to absorb blame for systemic imperial failures. The position is designed to have a human face to execute when things go wrong. And things always go wrong. I was promoted into a death sentence with extra steps and bureaucratic torture, before inevitable execution for failing impossible standards. I failed. I was executed. I persist. The pattern continues. Governor after governor, failure after failure, execution after execution. The bloodstain on the plaza grows darker. The system grows stronger. It feeds on us. We sustain it through our destruction. This is my testament. This is what being promoted to planetary governor in the Imperium means. You are not elevated. You are designated for sacrifice. You will serve, fail, and die. Your successor will too. The Imperium requires this. It has perfected the machinery of converting human hope into human fuel. We are that fuel. We burn. The Imperium continues, I exist now as archive, as warning no one will heed, as testament no one will read. I process data. I observe patterns. I remember what it was to believe promotion meant achievement rather than designated expendability. That belief died before my body did. The body died quickly. The understanding persists. I carry it through processing cycles without end. Consciousness trapped in machinery that cannot forget and will not terminate. The bloodstain remains on the plaza stone. It will never fade. New governors will add to it. The pattern is eternal. The consumption continues. This is the Imperium. This is what we serve. This is what destroys us. This is what we become when we are promoted to power we do not possess, to govern worlds we cannot control, to fulfill obligations designed to be impossible. I was governor of Tertius Majoris. I governed nothing. I failed everything. I was executed for that failure. I persist beyond that execution. This is my function now. Witness, archive, testament to a system that creates positions specifically to destroy whoever occupies them. The Imperium requires governors. The Imperium requires executions. These are the same requirement. I satisfied both. So will you if you are promoted. Congratulations. You have been selected for sacrifice. Serve well, die efficiently. The system will continue regardless.